Hello, this is Jerry Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Judge's House, Fire Being Investigated, Free Hospitalized from WizTV.com, posted by EmptyRow5585, and yeah, personally, I don't really care for everyone's always gonna try and push whatever narratives they have when it comes to this. A lot of left-wing people are saying, "Oh, this was right-wing violence because he just had a ruling against the Trump administration." A lot of right-wing people are saying, "No, this is left-wing violence because she was Jewish, and the left isn't really big into Jews." And yeah, you could also argue that maybe it was an accidental fire or self-inflicted arson. The non-politically correct term for that would be Jewish lightning, and the judge's last name was Goodstein. That's almost comically Jewish, I would say, the last name. But regardless, ultimately, it's like with everything, people are going to immediately jump to whatever conclusions they want to jump to, and that just goes to show more people care about narratives than actually waiting to find out what actually happened. And that's just very much social media for you. It's the narrative above all else. Facts don't really matter. Well, the narrative is all that matters. And this is just another example of people looking to get the narrative in before the facts come out. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, "Am I an idiot or is this just going too far?" posted by Wonderful Regret 252, and they link to a YouTube video, "The Real Reason Trump is Giving Argentina Money for More Perfect Union." And they added, "I'm probably an idiot. I thought Milei was an actual libertarian, not some wannabe. I thought his connection to Trump was merely a publicity stunt. I'm an idiot for not seeing it sooner and turning away from the truth. For all the talk of the reform and cuts to the bureaucracy, Milei only furthered the cronyist agenda. This deal with Trump was always coming. It's a giant government-to-government bribe. Tell me I'm wrong. More Perfect Union gets stuff wrong sometimes. Tell me this is one of those times. I just can't believe it. Not Milei, not the Chainsaw Man. No." And yeah, personally, I don't really. I think Milei's probably one of the better world leaders from a libertarian perspective. But I have heard that he might have been a WEF plant to discredit libertarianism as well. Personally, I like a lot of what he's doing economically down in Argentina. Even if sometimes Argentina's debt is just so massive that I could see justifying relying on the U.S. and these government to help get it out of it. But with that being said, just because I like Milei and what he's economically doing in Argentina doesn't mean that, I think the U.S. government sending him money is justified. It's very much like with Israel or Ukraine. The U.S. government shouldn't be sending taxpayer dollars overseas. That's very much my perspective on every country outside. Taxpayer dollars going to any country outside the U.S. And yeah, personally, I think if taxpayers want to voluntarily earmark their money for Argentina or Israel or Ukraine or whatever country they want to, I think that would be fine. But right now, you're forced to send your taxpayer dollars to wherever the government says they should go to, and that might be a foreign country that you don't really care for. And yeah, personally, I do think, I do like Milei, as I said, but ultimately it comes down to that the U.S. shouldn't be throwing money there just because they politically agree with who's in charge. That's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Judge Immergut has called a 10 p.m. hearing about Trump circumventing her order about the National Guard troops in Portland from BlueSky.app, posted by Swampinky, that's cross-post from the Law subreddit. And that looks like a tweet, or a Blue Sky post, I should say, from Katie Fang. "Judge Immergut isn't playing around, and I suspect will slam the Trump administration for trying to run her order from yesterday, blocking Trump's call up of Oregon's National Guard in Portland." And she quote tweeted a guy named Kyle Cheney, who tweeted, "Breaking: Judge Immergut has called 10 p.m. ET hearing on Trump's effort to circumvent our National Guard order by calling up California troops." And yeah, personally, ultimately, it's very much sometimes the state has quarrels amongst itself. And this is one of those instances, ultimately, I think it comes down to who enforces the law rather than who makes the laws. And ultimately, the judges, they might try and enforce the law, but ultimately, they're not the ones the National Guard troops who are actively out in the streets. And if Trump, since he's ultimately in the highest position of authority, he can ultimately justify pretty much whatever he wants to in regards to sending the National Guard to Portland. So that's on that. It just goes to show you that a lot of people are going to defer to what the president says, since the president is pretty much the king at this point. And yeah, ultimately I don't really care for it, but it's something that was increasingly that was only increased over the previous centuries. It used to be this way, like back to George Washington or the first couple presidents, but then Abraham Lincoln comes in and massively centralizes the bureaucracy during the Civil War, and then Woodrow Wilson, FDR kind of centralized power in the presidency as well, and that just goes to show I personally don't really care for it, but ultimately a lot of people are going to follow whatever the president says, even if a judge says he can't do that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have maybe the government is too much power, posted by Tom Q Masters, and that's a meme they posted of a guy shrugging. He says, if you're worried the wrong people might get elected, maybe the government is too much power. And I would agree with that. A lot of people right now who are calling Trump a fascist were completely fine with fascism when it was Biden or Obama. But suddenly the outgroup takes power, and it's the worst thing ever. I'm sure that a lot of Republicans who are supporting every action Trump makes right now will be crying fascism or communism when the next Democrat takes power. It just goes to show you, most people don't have any consistent values other than my team good, your team bad. If you want to be libertarian, you got to have consistent values and call it authoritarianism, regardless of what branch of the Uniparty is currently in power. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have state media dresses guy up, calls him Antifa. 2 years ago, same guy they dressed up and called him Mexican Mafia, posted by FastSeaWorthiness739, and that's a cross post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And yeah, it looks like a video of from Fox News about a guy, I think Jesse Waters interviewing a guy named Eric, Antifa whistleblower, and then it cuts to an interview 2 years ago where he interviews looks like the same guy wearing kind of the same mask, named Ramon Mundo Mendoza, former Mexican Mafia member. And yeah, that just goes to show you, ultimately you can't believe everything the TV says, and Reddit always loves calling out Fox News for that, but ultimately I think you gotta remember that Reddit always supports ABC, CBS, NBC, and all the other mainstream media that more aligns with their narratives, and that's important to note as well. Reddit only loves calling out the outgroup. Since Fox News is outgroup coded, Reddit always loves calling it out. But if media is ever in-group coded, like ABC News or the Washington Post, Reddit will always say, well, yes, they're run by billionaires, and I hate billionaires, but these are sources that are historically trusted, and that just goes to show you, no source is entitled to your trust. Not me, not Fox News, not the Washington Post, not anyone, because ultimately, people should trust who they trust, and trust whoever you want to, but ultimately every source is going to have an agenda, and that's why I traditionally don't really care for the big historic major media conglomerates like Fox News or ABC News or the like, because they're just the platforms that are controlled by the ultra wealthy. And it's interesting, back in the old days, the media used to be pretty much just free channels: ABC, CBS, NBC, I guess whatever newspapers were around back then as well. And nowadays, you can listen to pretty much any nut job or schizo you want to on social media, and I think that's very much a win for libertarianism. Now everyone increasingly has access to a platform to share their views and opinions, and I think that's very much the libertarian position. Rather than having centralized media, we have very much decentralized media. With that being said, I do think it could be decentralized more. A lot of sources, a lot of the web is very centralized right now between like X, YouTube, Reddit, and all that. Maybe it could decentralize a little more, but that's just me kind of picking at eggshells, I would say, on that front, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Massey is telling no lies, posted by Donald Key, and that looks like a screenshot of a tweet he made. The government shut down, but the House refuses to go back in session. Why are we in recess? Because the day we go back into session, I have 218 votes for the discharge petition to force a vote on releasing the Epstein files, as Speaker Johnson doesn't want that to be the news. And yeah, personally, I would agree with that. I think I liked and retweeted that tweet, and yeah, personally, I think that's why the Epstein files are never going to come out, because they jeopardize too many people in power, and that's why this might end up being a permanent government shutdown, so they never get to have to release the Epstein files. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for I really do wish the Epstein files would come out, but ultimately I don't think anyone would accept the Epstein files because they've released them like 50. They've seemingly released them like 50 times at this point, and each time people don't accept them because they are either censored too much or the wrong people weren't incriminated by them. So yeah, ultimately I don't think the Epstein files, they've been so developed at this point. I don't think they're going to satisfy anyone if they ever do eventually get released in full. But yeah, that's something that I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens. Personally, I think they might just get the government permanently shut down so they never have to release them. Next, we have Trump says he will speak to the Department of Justice about whether departing convicted child sex trafficker Ghislaine Maxwell, and claims that Puff Daddy P. Diddy also asked for a pardon. Posted by Donald Key, and that cross was from the Mayor McCheese subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think Ghislaine Maxwell or Puff Daddy should be pardoned because they both were involved in sex trafficking. But ultimately, if the government wants to pardon anyone for whatever reason it wants to, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's why the state, the state. I don't think the state should have control over the prison and pardon system because ultimately they can abuse that just like they abuse every other system that they have control over, and this is just another example of that. It's just like, Reddit cares about this, but they didn't care when Joe Biden gave a blanket pardon to his son that he said he wouldn't pardon, and that just goes to show you, Reddit only cares that the outgroup, the pardon power of the president when the outgroup has the presidency, not when the in-group does. Next, we have Trump threatens to invoke the Insurrection Act in Portland, and that's posted by Donald Key, and that's crossed from the Law subreddit. President Trump on Monday, and it's from thehill.com. President Trump on Monday said he was considering invoking the Insurrection Act to justify sending federal troops into Portland, Oregon, and avoid any legal hurdles. Trump, in remarks from the Oval Office, linked the situation in Portland to an insurrection, though he said he has yet to make a decision on invoking the Insurrection Act. And yeah, personally, that's why I don't think we should have the Insurrection Act. It's just ripe for abuse by the government, just like any other act is, and that just goes to show you that they wanted Reddit wanted to label January 6th as an insurrection and charge everyone involved with the Insurrection Act, but then now the outgroup's using it, and suddenly it's the worst thing ever, and that just goes to show you, Reddit, they love government for terrorism when there's party in power, but when the other branch of the unit party's in power, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.